I interviewed Serdar Arena, who is everybody says is Turkey's most famous ad man. He's very funny and very brilliant and had many things to say, which I put in the book. And he told me a lot about being, for instance, modern and Muslim, because that was his background, and to be both. He was the guy that basically started showing the real Turkey. He said advertising in Turkey was very pretentious. We try and copy the French or the Italian or the British, but it was nothing like the people you see on the street with the teeth missing and the veil, and the people who really buy brands like Pepsi. So he was the person who did that in my market is somebody called Dave Trott, who just showed the real Turkey. Part of the real Turkey is this woman, Azra, who is a very famous entertainer. This was a commercial for Pepsi, and it's about these three boys who pop round, and she gives them Pepsi, and she gives them mobile minutes. And the only slightly Turkish twist is that Azra is the most famous transvestite in Turkey. And the running joke is that these boys don't know, and they visit, and he creates what he calls, his whole philosophy is instant fame. He's one of those types of advert guy. But he finds these ways of finding the contradictions. That Turkey is just unimaginable to a sort of simple, ordered Western mind, because you have, the women in the miniskirts and the veils, and they're often sisters, or it's on a different day, and it's this mix where they go, well, it's both, it's not one or the other. And he just manages to speak about Turkey. They hired him because he almost destroyed their brand 8 years earlier for a Turkish brand called Cola Turca, which took all Pepsi's market share, so they hired him to bring the Turkish factor. This is Nada Debs, who is a Lebanese, very Islamic designer. You can see a furniture design, but she grew up in Japan, and she just gradually worked out how to make things which were both Japanese and Arab. And she said, again, like the chef, she worked out how to be Japanese. Arab is very emotional, very decorative, all this arabesque and these beautiful patterns, and Japan is very formal, and she's found something in between that's huge. If you know anything about the furniture world, she's a very big name because she's found something quite unique and universally relevant in the mix. This is about layers of time. I won't go into this. This is a museum in Abu Dhabi. I walked around this. It's now been built, but this is an example of where an entire city has been reconstructed. The downtown Beirut, it was destroyed by the civil war. This was literally where the tanks were, and it was destroyed. It then became the largest archaeological dig in the world, because this city has been continuously used for 5,000 years, and there were all these remains. And now they've built the new city around the old archaeology. You can walk along, for instance, if you go through the souk, it is literally on the ground plan of the Roman market. And you can go down some steps and visit a Phoenician harbour. And it's all this idea, the Amira who showed me around said it's all about layering history. It's you're standing here now, but who stood here then? That street was Roman, that well was a well to a starter. We have all this history. And it's a very urgent issue in Beirut because they had this civil war, because they don't have a common identity. And they had to find literally common ground, and they can find it in their history, and that's the vision of this. It's also spectacular. It's Zaha Hadid and all these world-renowned architects working on this. This is a brand I like very much, another furniture brand called Boksha, and what they do is they take something typically like an Eames chair that they found on a skip in Beirut, and then they cover it with all these different fabrics and lots of storytelling, and they make amazing things, and they call it the archaeology of the future. It's about taking a piece of Ottoman textile, putting next to a Japanese manga, putting next to words and other stuff, and making something new. And again, these have been a big trend since about 2 years ago, when they were the hit of Milan Fashion Week. This is something that's being built at the moment called the Red Sea Astrarium, and it's got this. I love the counterpoint, because in America, Umberto Eco, the Italian academic, quote, semiotician, he said that Disneyland exists to make the rest of America look real. And so the whole concept of a theme park is to be the fantasy, to be more than the real thing. And here there is the opposite. We're going into history and into the future. It is an astrarium, it's got a Star Trek thing, it's got all this stuff of exploring the stars, and you can tour the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And like Lebanon, it's weaving in the history, the education, lifelong learning. and also having thrilling rides. I hope that thing goes quite fast or something like that. Two more, emerge with, which it feels quite familiar, but I think part of my interest, particular interest in doing this book came from 2 years ago when I went to a conference all about Arab Spring. And I thought, Christ, I mean, we think we know what social media are for, but they're just changing the world with this in the Middle East, and really, they really are social media. And there are many examples in the book. What I particularly pick up on is actually the use of humour and satire, which is not a new thing that's been happening in protests for 1,000 years in Europe, but the way in which jokes and ideas, there's a puppet show in Syria, which is just the funniest thing you'll ever see, but it's the way that they're actually showing the people this is how the system works. And there's a real sort of consciousness, like there was perhaps in Paris in '68, of actually this is what's wrong with the world, and there's very much, they don't have a plan for the future, like Occupy don't really have a plan. They just had a lot of problems with their current range of dictators, but use social media brilliantly and in a very human way. This was an advertising example in Tunisia. After Ben Ali, the dictator, had gone, they did a survey, this NGO did a survey and found that only about 50% of the people were planning to vote. They're just not used to voting, they don't know what voting is. And so the ad agency put up one poster in the port in Tunis of Ben Ali, and it caused a riot, as intended. It was secretly filmed. People came up and said, "No, is he back?" And they tore this poster down. And behind that poster was another poster which said, "If you don't vote, we could have dictatorship back." And it was a great effectiveness study, actually. It won awards at Cannes, but millions of people saw this. It was all over the national news. And they just made a very simple point, and they mostly made it by creating a viral video, which then got them news coverage and so forth. Burak Arakan is a MIT-trained artist who makes art out of networks. He became famous for a 3-year study of his own spending patterns on MasterCard. And he created a computer program to predict what he would do, and then this would be updated, and it was in various art galleries. This is in a friend's flat. When he returned to Istanbul from MIT, he explored something called Ergenekon, which was this secret shadow government conspiracy, and there was a court document this thick of 2,500 pages, and he analysed what are the connections between the names, and he made a network. And everybody in Istanbul and all the media and everyone went to see it because they were trying to find out who is the boss, who was the number one. And he said, there is no number one, it's a network. This is the ideology of the future, this is how it works. You can see it, I'm not trying to say anything, and these things here, people were making more connections in the text, it was very interactive. He has this vision of really the way that networks are enabling a new type of society, a new type of consciousness, and he just shows the networks. He made a piece this year showing mosques, Republican statues, and shopping malls, because he says these are the three ideologies, and he just maps them, and what are the relationships, and so forth. Where are they? How do they relate to each other? I did a whole series, or a blogger, in fact, in Indonesia, did a whole series of interviews with me with this little group of quite young girls who, in Indonesia, they had a very secular government, Suharto, and then they kicked him out 10 years ago, and it became very fashionable, actually, for the young fashionable people to go back to Islamic dress, and this whole range of fashion designers have emerged, and these pictures don't do them justice, but it's like seeing Paris Fashion Week or something. There's things inspired by Bedouin, very catwalk, very high fashion and also street fashion, and it burst out of nowhere about 2 years ago, because one simple change, they moved from being a BlackBerry group, which was this 30 friends, to being on Twitter, and 1,000 people joined the first morning, and it just went boom, because this was so relevant to Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, this huge generation of very connected people who were just waiting for something to emerge, and now there are magazines and fashion shows and events, and all these other brands have developed, but it was just social media enabled this cluster to appear from nowhere. Finally, finding common ground. So in places like Beirut, it was sort of like Berlin after the Second World War. There were literally crossing guards and quarters and people not meeting. And one person who was fed up with that, who's become a famous social entrepreneur, was Kamal Muzuak. And he created a farmer's market. And he was a food writer, he'd been covering the whole country, but he created a farmer's market so that everybody would get into one space. And he said, while we may have totally different religions and totally different ideologies,